Today we are going to talk about Jonathan Swift, his politics, and the way in which he considered literature and writing. When we think of Jonathan Swift, most people immediately think of Gulliver's Travels. They remember the tiny people of Lilliput, the giants of Brobdingnag, and perhaps the strange horses and savage yahoos of the final part of the book. But Swift was much more than the author of a famous fantasy. He was one of the sharpest, angriest, funniest, and most unsettling writers in English literature. To understand Swift, we need to begin with conflict. In a letter from December 1703, he described 10 days of what he called the most extreme and violent party conflict he had ever known, whether from personal experience or from books. He was talking about the reign of Queen Anne, a time when politics and religion were deeply entangled. Much of the tension came from arguments over the privileges and authority of the Anglican Church, but the spirit of faction had spread everywhere. Swift, with his typical ironic exaggeration, even said that stray dogs seemed more insolent and quarrelsome than usual. That image tells us a lot about him. Swift was fascinated by politics, but he was also disgusted by it. He was drawn to public life, yet constantly repelled by the selfishness, vanity, and stupidity he saw in it. And this brings us to another of his obsessions, the uneasy connection between human beings and animals. Again and again in his writing, Swift asks a disturbing question: how rational are we, really? Swift was born in Dublin in 1667 to English parents who had settled in Ireland not long before. He was brought up within the Anglican tradition and later became a clergyman in the Irish Church. He held a church income for much of his life, but he was always hoping for a better position in the richer Church of England. That ambition never really succeeded. This partly explains why Swift often seems like a divided man. He wrote powerful works in defense of Ireland and against English interference, and for that reason is often seen as an important voice of Protestant Ireland in the 18th century. But emotionally, he often felt like an exile, even in his own birthplace. He did not fully belong to Ireland, and he did not fully belong to England either. He was caught in between. That sense of division shaped his writing. Swift's works are full of tension, ambiguity, and reversal. He rarely speaks in a simple, direct voice. Instead, he loves masks, invented speakers, ironic narrators, and unstable points of view. He likes making the reader uncomfortable. He likes forcing us to question what we are hearing. In his world, nothing is completely secure, and no voice can be trusted too easily. As a young man, Swift spent time in England in the household of Sir William Temple, an important diplomat and writer. This was an important stage in his life. During this period, he wrote in support of William III, whose victory over James II had enormous consequences, especially for Ireland. Swift believed in the principle of the Glorious Revolution, and he described himself for a time as a lover of liberty, even as a Whig in the broad political sense. But there was a complication. He also strongly believed in the supremacy of the Anglican Church, and in religious matters he was deeply conservative. This is where Swift becomes especially interesting. The causes he supported did not always fit neatly together. He believed in liberty, but also in religious authority. He valued order, but hated corruption. He disliked inconsistency in others, yet his own political path moved in contradictory directions, eventually bringing him closer to the Tories and also, in a different way, to Irish Protestant nationalism. Swift is never simple. He always caught between principles that do not sit comfortably side by side. One of his early major works was A Tale of a Tub, and it shows this perfectly. It is a strange, energetic, unpredictable prose satire, probably begun in 1690s and published in 1704. At its center is a story about three brothers who represent Catholicism, Anglicanism, and Calvinist Protestantism. Their father leaves them codes, which stand for original Christian doctrine. Over time, each brother alters his coat according to fashion, vanity, and self-interest, then tries to justify the change with absurd reasoning. The idea is simple, but the execution is anything but simple. The text keeps interrupting itself. It shifts voice, changes direction, goes off into long digressions about literature, criticism, and madness. It feels unstable on purpose. Swift is not just attacking religious error, he is also creating a form that reflects confusion, distortion, and intellectual chaos. In the end, the Anglican brother Martin comes out looking like the most legitimate figure, which tells us a lot about Swift's own loyalties. A few years later, Swift added an apology for the author, where he partly defended the work as a product of youthful energy, but also praised the Anglican Church as the most perfect in doctrine and discipline. And in that context, he made an important distinction between wit and humor. Today, we often blur those ideas together, but for Swift, they were not the same thing. Wit meant intellectual quickness, the ability to connect ideas in surprising ways. Humor was more playful, more social, more agreeable. Swift wanted both. He wanted sharp intelligence and comic energy together. That combination also shapes The Battle of the Books, another work published in 1704. This satire comes out of the famous quarrel between the ancient and the moderns. Should people admire classical authors as the highest models, or should they celebrate modern writing and modern learning? Many writers discuss this question in a very solemn way. Swift naturally turned it into comic warfare. In the Battle of the Books, classical and modern authors literally fight each other in a library. One of the most memorable moments is the contrast between the spider and the bee. The spider represents the moderns. It spins its web out of its own body. The bee represents the ancients. It gathers material from nature and produces what Swift famously calls sweetness and light. It is a brilliant image because it turns literary criticism into fable. But even here, Swift is not simply making a dry argument. He's also mocking the vanity and absurdity of intellectual battles themselves. As Swift grew older, his satire became even harder and darker. He often used the technique of the mask. He let an invented speaker talk in a calm, convincing voice, while the reader slowly realizes how disturbing that voice really is. In a meditation upon a broomstick, he imitates the style of a serious moral essay, but chooses a ridiculous object as his subject. The joke lies in the contrast between the solemn manner and the trivial topic. But the most famous example, of course, is A Modest Proposal, published in 1729. It is one of the most shocking texts in English literature. The fifth speaker suggests, in a cool and reasonable tone, that poor Irish children should be sold as food. The idea is monstrous, and that is exactly the point. Swift is exposing the cruelty of people who discuss poverty as if human beings were only numbers, burdens, or economic objects. The power of the piece comes from its style. It does not scream, it calculates. It sounds rational. That cold precision makes it horrifying. Another major work connected to Ireland is Drapier's Letters. These letters were written in a voice of a Dublin draper, a tradesman, and they protest against the English economic policy towards Ireland. What matters here is not only the political message, but the voice Swift creates. It sounds local, confident, practical, and sometimes patriotic, but even ironic. Swift had an extraordinary gift for choosing exactly the right voice for the effect he wanted. That gift reaches its highest point in Gulliver's Travels, published in 1726. The full title is Travels into Several Remote Nations of the World. But of course, everyone knows it's simply as Gulliver's Travels. On the surface, it looks like an adventure story. Lemuel Gulliver is a surgeon, educated and practical, who travels to strange lands and reports what he sees. But Swift uses this travel narrative to examine politics, science, pride, reason, the body, and the limits of human nature. Gulliver is an excellent narrator for Swift's purposes because he is both capable and limited. He is intelligent, observant, he is brave and adaptable, he learns languages, he pays attention to details, and often behaves sensibly. But he's also naive. He does not always understand what he is seeing. He is often too proud of his own culture, and sometimes he draws completely wrong conclusions. In the first two voyages, Swift plays with physical scale. In Lilliput, everything is tiny, and Gulliver becomes a giant. In Brobdingnac, everything is enormous, and Gulliver becomes tiny. These changes in scale are funny, but they are also morally revealing. The politics of Lilliput are petty, ridiculous, and cruel, clearly echoing the pettiness of European politics. In Brobdingnac, Gulliver proudly explains English civilization, only to hear the king conclude that the English are basically hateful little vermin. Swift forces us to see ourselves from the outside. He also forces us to confront the body. Gulliver's Travels is full of things that later readers and editors sometimes wanted to remove. Bodily functions, smells, dirt, decay, skin, hair, disgust. Swift wants to break the illusion of human dignity when that dignity is based only on pride or appearance. He keeps reminding us that human beings are physical creatures, not pure minds. In the third voyage, the focus shifts more toward mental distortion. We encounter strange experiments, abstract thinkers, and the terrible Straldbrugs, who are immortal but continue to age and decay. Immortality here is not a blessing. It becomes a nightmare. Swift strips away another comforting illusion. Then comes the fourth voyage, the most disturbing part of the whole book. Gulliver arrives in the land of the Houyhnhnms, rational horses who live in an orderly society, and the Yahoos, filthy and degraded human-like creatures. Gulliver desperately wants to identify with the horses and reject the Yahoos. He tries to distance himself from humanity itself. But this desire becomes unhealthy, even insane. He cannot accept the complexity of human being, the fact that we are both rational and animal, both noble and disgusting, both capable of thought and driven by instinct. By the end of the novel, Gulliver comes home unable to bear human company. He prefers the stable. He says that his horses understand him fairly well. It is one of the bleakest endings in literature because it shows a mind that has lost all balance. Reason and feeling, body and mind, humanity and self-hatred have been torn apart. Some readers have taken this as Swift's own final judgment on humanity, but that is too simple. Swift is not Gulliver. We should be very careful not to confuse the narrator with the author. Swift could be savage, he could be disgusted, and yes, in his later works, especially like The Lady's Dressing Room or A Beautiful Young Nymph Going to Bed, he returns to themes of bodily decay, sexual disgust, and the gap between appearance and reality. But that does not mean he simply hated human beings. In fact, Swift once told Alexander Pope that he loved individual people sincerely, even if he hated what he called that animal called man. That sentence is classic Swift. It sounds like pure misanthropy, but underneath there is moral frustration. Swift is angry not because he expects nothing from humanity, but because he expects more. He is furious at our lack of proportion, our self-deception, our refusal to admit what we are.